Hello and welcome to the Agile Innovation Leaders Podcast. I'm Ola Ojako. On this podcast, I speak with world-class leaders and doers about themselves and a variety of topics spanning agile, lean innovation, business, leadership, and much more, with actionable takeaways for you, the listener. So I have with me Brant Cooper, who is the author of the books Lean Entrepreneur and his latest one, Disruption Proof: Empower People, Create Value, Drive Change. He also is the CEO and founder of Moves the Needles. Brant, it is a pleasure and an honor to have you as my guest on the Agile Innovation Leaders podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Now, Brent, as I start with all my guests, we want to know a bit more about you. So could you tell us about yourself, growing up, your background? Are there any experiences that have made a great impact on you that have led to you becoming the Brent we see today?
Yeah, so born and mostly raised in California, which seems to be somewhat unique these days, but also did travel around a bit. My dad was a Navy man. I don't know, I guess I was always a little bit different. I think a lot of us describe ourselves that way, but when I went away to school for college, most people were focusing on one major or maybe two majors because that was sort of the state of the world. It's kind of, this is a little while ago. But supposedly what you needed to do is go and get narrow expertise, and then that was what was going to launch your career. But to me, that was boring. And so I wanted to take a little bit of everything. So chemistry and calculus and sociology and psychology and history and creative writing and literature. So I was sort of all over the map. And I don't know, I guess it's kind of funny. You can look back on your life and find these little threads that weave through everything. When I left college and got my first job, I remember specifically I was in Washington, D.C., and I was sitting on the stoop of the house that I was living in. And I was all like, really, is this it? Is this the rest of my life, is working 9 to 5 doing, what people are telling me to do? I go, wow, that doesn't seem like the bargain I thought it was. So I actually dropped out and wrote a novel, which was very sophomoric, because unless you're a genius, most 20-something-year-olds really don't know that much about the world. But anyway, it was sort of this empowering moment when I just sort of had faith in myself that I would always be able to take care of myself and figure things out. And so it's really one of these moments where the moment you feel like you can just leave a job, you get a tremendous amount of power from that. Most people go through their lives feeling like they have to do what their boss says and they have to live that life, and it becomes, your choices obviously become quite limited. So I ended up crossing the country back to California, moved up to the Bay Area, worked in a few jobs there, tried unsuccessfully to sell my book. And then I joined my first startup. So this is the, .com era, the 90s. And it was really there at this startup that I caught wind of the fact that there were actually these jobs where you weren't supposed to just do what you're told, that your responsibility was to figure things out, to exercise your own creativity and your own intelligence. And nobody was going to sit there over your shoulder, that you were going to be held accountable to what you were doing or what you weren't doing, but you were literally sort of on your own. And that was, again, sort of the second moment of feeling this sense of empowerment. And it's funny because up to that point, maybe I wasn't an A player, as the startup likes to talk about, the startup myths, you have to go hire all those A players. Maybe I just wasn't an A player, but I used to be passed around like a hot potato between all of these managers, because nobody really wanted to manage me because I really didn't do what they said. I did what I thought was best. But anyway, so the startup sort of launched this new type of, so then even in the startups, I worked at a bunch of different jobs. So instead of, again, specializing, I was in IT, and then I ran the professional services group, and then I went into product management, and then I took over marketing, sort of helping out salespeople. So I sort of traversed the whole, uh, all of the different functions inside the company. And I guess I think that was also a big learning moment for me. And so I lived through that, tried a couple of my own companies that failed, and others that succeeded crazily, and others that, ramped up their sales, but then they tailed off. And I was on the management team trying to figure things out. And it's funny because you always learn more from failures. And I think that the last one, the way I talk about it is that the sort of the company strategy was dictated every week by whoever was the best arguer. Like, so it was just like a management team free for all, and whoever won, that would set the strategy. And so I sort of won for, a year and a half, and we grew like crazy. And I had, allies on the team. And then they kind of changed their mind and got rid of me and got rid of my allies. And then they went back and did whatever they wanted to do, the founders. So it was all, again, it's sort of this learning moment where maybe that's not the best way to make decisions. But so the dot-com bust happened, and I was actually writing and blogging about, well, what makes successful startups better? What makes them successful compared to all of the ones that fail? And what is it about, sort of this idea of learning and empowering people to learn rather than just execute? And so I was blogging about that stuff and got turned on to Steve Blank and to Eric Ries, and I ended up writing the first book that talked about lean startup and product market fit. And then that kind of launched this whole other career where at first we're focused on startups, but eventually I wrote The Lean Entrepreneur, and formed Moves the Needle to start taking some of these principles to large enterprises over the world. So around the last 10 years, been helping some of the biggest brands in the world try to adopt some of these principles of exploration, so learning mode. And yeah, that sort of takes us to where we are today. I am still doing that work in addition to some other things, but primarily it's focused on empowering employees to exercise their creativity and their inspiration and to drive impact. And then, helping the leadership understand that they get more out of their people if they enable that and take a step back, and then they get to be more proactive and more strategic in their own world, and it's sort of empowering to them as well. And I think really post-pandemic, we've sort of seen this shift where that's happening more once people are remote workers, workers being burned out and frustrated with work is when they don't get to do that sort of work. So yeah, it's sort of an interesting time, and really the rise of, sort of agile reaching a next level, and design thinking reaching the next level, and product management, and all of these things happening because the world is turning digital makes this a pretty exciting time to apply a lot of these principles.
You have a fascinating background, Brant, and there are some things that you said about your background that had me nodding, because I identify with it. And maybe in terms of, I love variety, and yes, I studied engineering, but I also kind of like to know a bit more about economics, psychology, the other subjects outside my normal domain. And I was having a conversation with someone, I can't remember his name again. I think it was Dr. Steve Morledge at a conference, and he was saying life is all integral, really. It's just us as human beings trying to make sense of the different aspects we've created, the disciplines. But in the truest sense, there aren't any distinctive lines, and it's all integral. And it helps, I've noticed, at least for me personally, just knowing a bit about other subjects outside my core area just helps me to be more well-rounded and more strategic, for lack of a better word, in how I approach
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean,
problems and issues. Go on.
yeah, it provides a larger context, I think, right? I mean, so if you can understand what the colleagues are doing in the other function, you can also see the bigger picture, which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And you mentioned something about not liking to be told what to do. So is that the definition of an entrepreneur, or could there be something else?
Well, I mean, I think it is. Yes, I think it probably is similar to most early stage entrepreneurs, but you know, you won't succeed as an entrepreneur if that's the only way you are. And so, we all kind of grow up a little bit. We have to mature in a way that we can still hold on to our creativity and all of these our instinct or whatever it is, but we also have to be able to listen to others and to
Yeah.
recognize when ideas are better than ours and change our minds based upon new indications. And so there's a flexibility that has to be built into there as well. It can't just be that you're gonna stick to your guns. As a matter of fact, like I get a lot of entrepreneurs saying like, oh, well, it's all about the conviction of your idea. And I go, sure, if you want to fail, that's great. But, if you really want to change the world as opposed to focus on a particular idea, then you have to be flexible. And I think that people always point to Steve Jobs and his genius. And I'm all like, yep, it took him a long time to get out, the product that really was putting a computer in everybody's pocket, which is kind of what his dream was in the beginning. It took him a long time to get to the iPhone. And that what was revolutionary about the iPhone actually was opening up the app store to third-party developers, because that
Yeah.
turned the phone into a platform. And yet he opposed it, even with all of his advisors telling him he had to do that. He didn't allow it the first year. And so it wasn't until the second year, when he changed his mind, that things really took off. And so I think it ends up being Steve Jobs is a great example, but not for the reason you think. So.
We could go into that, but I think would be going off tangent a bit. So what makes a lean entrepreneur? Because one of your books is titled The Lean Entrepreneur: How Visionaries Create Products, Innovate New Ventures, and Disrupt Markets.
I think fundamentally it's somebody that can admit when they're wrong or when they don't know. I mean, so the lean part of lean entrepreneur is about reducing waste. It's not about being small or not spending money. It's about not wasting money and not wasting time and resources and even your own passion and your own inspiration. How can we work to understand our customers more deeply? How can we work to understand the market better? How can we run experiments that bust through our assumptions? How do we even identify assumptions? And then how do we cut through our own biases and all of these things that are very human, but could be holding back the success of what we want to build or what we want to bring to the world. And so to me, that's the lean entrepreneur, is you have to be able to admit when you're wrong, admit when you don't know, and go out there and learn and hustle and explore and figure things out before you spend the time and money and resources executing on a particular idea.
So what I've heard you say is, being willing to change your mind when you are faced with, some evidence that your original assumptions are wrong, and also
Correct.
being mindful about how you use your resources. You're not wasteful. You're using it to learn and discover and learn what your customers want, so that you're better able to provide that to them.
That's
Right?
correct. And
Yeah.
yep. And so if you're sit down and you build a product for 6 months and then the product's wrong, or even, just a lot wrong, then there's a lot of waste that went into that. And when you're understanding customers, that doesn't mean ask your customers what they want and do what they say. It means understanding why are they saying what they're saying, and what is their environment, and what are their aspirations, and what are their real needs. It's up to you as the, sort of as the product person or the solution provider, to come up with what is the best way for me to address those needs. But the only way you can really truly understand those needs is to dive as deeply as possible in understanding the customer and their environment.
Are there any specific examples of how, as a lean entrepreneur, I can dive more into knowing what
Sure. I mean,
the customer does or
right. I
needs?
mean, I think that, Steve Blank's customer development stuff was always really about understanding customers more. I think it was like, in my opinion, a little bit shallow compared to some of the techniques that are used in human-centered design or design thinking, where you're getting down to emotional levels and you're getting down to, empathy and really understanding, and you're kind of zooming in and zooming out. You can zoom in and interview, that's fine, but you can also zoom out and trying to figure out, well, what would this mean to them if they were successfully doing what they wanted to do? Would they be able to take their family to Italy in the summertime? Is that what they aspire to? Do they want to be a better mother? Do they like, what is actually driving individuals to make the decisions that they're making? Uh, Observation is a great way to learn about that. That's, often used in human-centered design when you're even in, business to business type of solutions, is you go walk people do the work that they're doing in their environment, and you can start picking up on all sorts of issues that they're constantly having to overcome, or conflicts, or things don't work in a particular environment, or IT does not allow this. I mean, there's all sorts of things that can educate you about the needs that you're trying to address.
Hmm. Hmm. No, I completely agree. And for you, would you say that, being a lean entrepreneur, is it just for individuals who set up their own startups or early growth companies? Can it also apply within a large established organization with, say, thousands of employees already?
Yeah, no, I think that it's a good question. I think that the example that I give is, if you look back to Henry Ford's Model T, right? You build a factory, and then you build a whole company around this highly optimized, efficient assembly line that can produce the same vehicle. He's sort of famously saying you can have a Model T in any color you want as long as
As
it's
long as it's
black.
black.
Right. That's the only thing that he's going to produce. And so he optimizes the flow of resources through the manufacturing. And then he builds the rest of the company based upon functions, this whole linear fashion. Everybody do what we've already proven needs to be done. Then you can produce a car that the middle class could buy, which was a new thing and opened up this crazy new market. So that's very well understood. Everything is really, there's not a lot of uncertainty. But if you fast forward to the digital age, there's tons of uncertainty, right? All of the products and services that are produced have multiple models and multiple options on each model, and hundreds of colors. And there's a lot of choices for consumers to choose one over the other. So consumers don't have the same brand loyalty that they used to. They can change their minds overnight. And again, this is true in the business world, not just consumers. But so there's so much uncertainty there that you actually have to then understand the niche desires of all of these different market segments out there. Well, the only way to do that, so if you imagine that organization that is only allowed to do what you're told to do based upon how it used to work, then you're the one that's going to miss out on all those opportunities based upon creating exactly the model or the options that the customer wants. How do you know what it is that those customers want? Well, you have to be out and interact with them. So even the biggest companies in the world have to figure out how they're going to start learning from the environment that they're in. So that's number one. Big companies have to do it, and they are doing it more and more. Design and product management and all of these these practices are emerging in these companies to do that exactly. And I think that the other point is that the world is so interconnected now, and this again has been brought upon by the digital revolution. And so what that causes is that all of these disruptions that we've just experienced here in the last 4 or 5 years, things like the pandemic, inflation, supply chain shocks, reverberations from the war, just on and on. All of these things sort of ripple across our economies. They could be isolated in different pockets of the world without affecting the rest of the world. Now everything affects everything. It's like the butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon or something like this. It creates this chaos. And so what that means is that disruptions, not as bad as the pandemic, but disruptions like ransomware attacks that cause disruptions, or again, supply chain issues, all of these things ripple across the economy and they actually change the market. So if you worked on your marketing plan and your selling plan the day after the pandemic hit, you're not in execution. You're just flailing. You have to actually be able to readdress what is our situation currently based upon the current environment. How do we change our work in order to adapt to this new environment? And that is just a skill that everybody needs and everybody has to develop. And those are startups do it naturally. Big companies need to try to figure out how they're going to build that in. And this is sort of the rise of Agile, right? I mean, so I think that the way I describe Agile, or the way I picture it for people without getting into all of the jargon, is like a meerkat. So a tribe of meerkats every once in a while come out of their hole and they pick their heads up and they look around and they take in new information, and they're going to decide what to do based upon that new information. So if you're a big corporation, you need to pause your work, which would be like an agile sprint.
Yeah.
You look up from the work. What has changed? Are we making the right progress? Right? We check within our customers. We check with our stakeholders. How do we improve our work as a team so that our output is better? So you take that moment to pause regularly. You can make your sprint lengths anything that you want. I really don't care. It depends on the type of business that you're in. But you're pausing the work, you're reevaluating, you're taking in new information. And maybe the answer is you don't have to change your work at all. You can just go back. But there's likely sometimes changes that have to be made so that you're getting to the desired outcome more efficiently. So we can't be like the assembly line, Ford's assembly line, where output was a proxy for outcome, i.e., we're going to be successful if we can produce the car at this cost. Now it's like we have to focus on efficiency of outcome and not efficiency of output. And that means that it's actually more efficient to pause and make changes during the course rather than only after failing at the very end.
There's a question, lots of things you've said that I resonate with. And one of my favorite questions to previous guests, and you would be the next one I'm asking this, is what would you define as output versus outcome? So what's an output to you versus what's an outcome?
Yeah, so like the Henry Ford example is the easiest. Output is the car is being produced. So the car has been manufactured. That's output. And for decades, even still today, businesses and economists using old antiquated models like Larry Summers does are focused on the efficiency of output. And what those are serving to do is being proxies for outcome. So outcome would be we've successfully sold those cars to happy customers. So they're going to buy again from us, and maybe they're going to get service from us, and maybe they're going to get financing from us, right? So we want to keep them satisfied. And also we get to generate income, and we pay our workers, and we actually pay our shareholders. So everybody gets sort of these outcomes or these desired results from successfully selling the car, which is dependent upon this efficient production of output. But now again, today, if you buy all of what else I've said, output is not a proxy of outcome. So output could be the number of cars that are produced. But if they're not sold and the customers aren't happy, then you're not going to be able to pay your shareholders, and you're not going to keep loyal customers, and you're not going to pay your workers. And so we have to now look at the efficiency of outcomes because the world is so complex. So that applies to, I think, any product. Obviously, when you go into the nuances of a corporate hierarchy, not everybody is focused on the final outcome. And so they actually have to have their own outcomes. But even in that regard, outcome is increased user satisfaction. Output is you've built X by a certain date. Outcome is, 1,000 people have opened your newsletter. 75% of people opened your newsletter. Output is we sent the newsletter to 10,000 people.
Hmm.
So the output is very focused on ourselves and the tasks that we're doing, usually over time period. Outcome is, what are we getting out of those tasks?
Hmm.
And it's best to measure that actually from who the beneficiary is, experience. So if I'm producing just a super simple example, if I'm producing this newsletter and people are opening it and spending time reading it, then that is a desired outcome. If nobody opens it, then that's sort of there's a variety of issues that might be involved there, but you haven't achieved the outcome despite your output.
Thanks for that explanation. And somebody else said something that stuck with me as well, which is that, outcome would signify some sort of change in behavior or in noticeable behavior from the perspective of whoever the customer is or who's consuming the results of your work. So
Totally agree with that, and way
Mm.
more succinct than what I said. And the focus really is, it's on, that's what I sort of refer to as the beneficiary, because sort of inside of an organization, your beneficiary of the work that you're doing are maybe internal people, not directly to the customer. So customers sort of in scare quotes. But I love the fact person mentioned behavior, because that's what actually allows us to measure it. And so even in the Lean Entrepreneur book, there's a section called the value stream discovery, which is focused on what is the behavior that I'm trying to get from my customer for everything that I'm doing as a business, and how do I measure that behavior is happening. And one of the benefits, of course, of the digital world is that you can measure a lot of that stuff. And so if you're trying to measure whether people are satisfied with your product, one proxy for that might be not just running surveys, but how often are they using the product? What are they actually doing with the product? It's not that they downloaded the app, it's that they downloaded the app, they installed it, they created an account, and they come in and they look at, these different screens and interact with them 4 times every week. Okay, that's what a satisfied customer looks like. How many do we have? What's the growth of satisfied customers year over year or month over month? So it gives us all of this way of starting to measure what the behavior side is, that becomes very powerful whenever we're doing our work.
And it helps with evidence-based decisions. So that helps you, because back to your explanation or your talk about Agile and how it should help with organizations and leaders with just periodically you do a bit of work in a sprint, but you look up and look around and know, okay, what we're doing, is it really moving us? Is it moving the needle? No, no, no pun intended. Is it moving the needle? Or is it pushing us, closer to where we want? Are we likely to achieve those
Exactly.
outcomes instead of focusing on how many widgets or gadgets we've produced within a sprint? So based on that, what are the things, can you give examples of, challenges you've observed maybe in organizations or startups with being able to apply this sort of iterative development mindset and still managing it with the needs to plan in longer time, across longer time horizons? Because some organizations, especially if you're, for example, publicly traded, or you still have to have a long-term, mid-term and short-term view. So what are the challenges you've experienced with them
Yeah.
balancing all these?
I think it's you're planning outcomes. And so I think that the difficulty is that when people look at the outcomes, like, well, we need to grow 5%, quarter over quarter or something like that. The difficulty ends up being when they have to translate those outcomes into what is the work that people need to do. And so we, at some point in that progression from the top leadership down to the ground floor, those outcomes get translated into output. And so we lose this connection between, is what we're working on actually going to achieve the desired outcomes? And this is what causes all of the reorganizations that happen every couple of years, because they don't match up. and then the board or the C-suite needs to do a reorganization because this is it's sort of their admission, their tacit admission that they failed in organizing the output to match the outcome. And so they get to have a reset. And so they fire a bunch of people and they reorganize and then they go do it again. So I think the biggest challenge is that it's really a ground up type of change that has to happen. And so a lot of I'm sure you're very familiar with a lot of the corporate implementations of Agile tend to be very process heavy and very, you must do it this way. And you've lost all of the Agile principles and the ethos that got you to want to do it in the first place.
Yeah.
And instead, it has to be very ground up. And it's really around, in my opinion, putting people on teams. So I don't think there's any individual inside of a company that should not be on a team. The team sort of will hold people socially accountable to their work. And if not, then there's still HR that can deal with it. But rather than have managers kind of leaning over and trying to get everybody to figure it out, sort of the classic Agile self-organized team where those teams have to be held accountable to the outcomes, but are empowered to figure out the work in order to achieve those outcomes. And then you practice that behavior. That behavior has to be practiced. It's not about like giving an order that now you have to work self-organized. You actually have to practice that behavior, and you build in some of these other empathy techniques as well as running experimentation, and you create an environment where, like, as a leader, you admit when you don't know and when you've made a mistake. So you're kind of demonstrating vulnerability and that we're actually living in this complex, uncertain world, so that you are empowering individuals to also behave the same way. And so you're starting to create this learning, exploration, balanced with execution type of organization. And I think inevitably you start seeing impact of that type of work. And that's really, I think, how you can start driving the longer term change that has to happen. It's really by taking pockets of the organization, teaching the behavior and practicing it. And then it's teaching and practicing leaders how to manage people that are working that way, which is different as well. I sort of view it as perhaps a little bit idealistically or even utopian is sort of cascading missions. And so the very top mission statements are around those things that you're promising Wall Street. Here's what our growth is going to be. Here's what we're going to achieve next quarter and 2 quarters from that. And then in order to achieve that, here's the different things that our business unit must achieve, the outcomes. And that drips all the way down in terms of outcomes to the point that you're assigning teams, here is your outcome. And you know how to do the work, or we'll help you figure out to do the work, or you could figure it out yourself. I mean, it depends on kind of the quality and the nature of those teams, but it's a way of organizing work where I think in the end, the company doesn't necessarily look that differently than it does now, but it's just not built sort of arbitrarily on function like it is now. And so by building sort of this mission oriented way, whenever there's uncertainty, you can put people on that mission that can help overcome the uncertainty. And so you get sort of the cross-functional and interdisciplinary nature when it's required. If it's not required, that's fine. They're, all manufacturers, they're working on that team. That's great. They know what their outcome is, and they're going to produce that outcome. But if it's uncertainty, how are we going to go and go into this new market? Okay, well, there's a lot of things that we know, but we should test those things that we don't know. And it's a different makeup of that team. Whereas now, if you're trying to do exploration work when the teams are organized by function, you have to sort of force that cross functionality, and it's very difficult, and it doesn't last long. If you don't keep the pressure on, everything kind of falls back into whatever their functional role is, as opposed to continuing to adopt and apply missions to these teams. Then they get the resources that they need in order to accomplish a particular mission, and then that should rise up to the level of whatever the company objectives are.
It's
That's my pipe dream.
No, but it is interesting, and it seems like you're a mind reader, because you did say initially, it has to start from the ground up. And I was going to ask you if there was any place at all for, the bigger North Star vision, mission to trickle down and influence what the people on the shop floor are doing in the coal face, as some people would use the term. And you've kind of answered it. So it's more of trickling down the mission, such that once it gets down to the teams actually doing the work, they understand what they're doing and how it's helping in their own way, how they're helping to achieve the bigger objective of the organization.
Yeah,
So
exactly. And I think
mm,
that that's what, again, going back to sort of the big quit and workers being burned out, I think that a lot of them, like whatever survey I've seen, even those produced by the big consultant firms, pretty much say that workers don't feel aligned.
mm,
They don't feel aligned with what the priorities are. Like they don't even know what they are, and they don't feel like they're driving an impact. And then that makes human beings feel like they're not making an impact in their own life, and it starts this downward spiral. Whereas we can create a fortuitous spiral if we actually allow these people to see the impact that they are making.
mm. And the benefit of working in an agile manner. Now, I do have my reservations about some people who have peddled agile as, like an elixir. You have a headache, agile will cure it. Oh, you
Right.
have you have a tummy ache, agile will cure it. Actually, it has its purpose, it has its remit, and it has, just like you'd have not multiple tools in a toolbox. Agile is really about, you sense, you respond, you build, you put it out there, you get feedback, quick feedback, and then you make adjustments as required, and then move, take the next step. So from that perspective, taking an agile um, approach to will I say, developing or building on or implementing strategy. Do you have any thoughts on how organizations can be more effective at it? I know you've talked about the ideal of cascading missions and then building up, but what else do you think organizations or leaders in organizations can take into account?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's just, one view into it. And so I think that I'm sure there's other ways of tackling it. I think that it's this idea of teams. Like, I think that everybody could start forming a team now, and it doesn't have to be permanent. Like, if there's a bunch of things that need to be done, find one part of uncertainty and form a team and give them the responsibility of solving that uncertainty. And so I think that it ends up then being, well, they don't need to necessarily learn agile or design thinking. I really think that if we measured the right things, human beings sort of know how to optimize what they're being measured for. And so I think that if you were to sit down with a group of your people and you were to say, listen, here's a business challenge that we have. I would really like you 4 or 5 people to go figure it out. I'm here to give you whatever help you need along the way. I'm here to mentor you, give you my own advice, do whatever, but I need you all to try to figure this out. And here's what the outcome is that we want to get from that. What do you think? And maybe there's a little bit back and forth, but I think that that's actually more important than any of the frameworks that even I talk about a lot. And so I think Agile was originally developed sort of around that concept, just very
Hmm.
specifically for software development teams. And so I think that it's thinking about the principles that can apply pretty much anywhere as opposed to the actual practices. I just also happen to think that there's a bunch of practices that can be beneficial. Things like the idea of what is the length of time you're going to put your head down versus when you look up, or
Yes.
how you're going to share your work, or all of those type of things. But I think that it's essentially, if we just gave a group of people a challenge and said, I'd really like you to help me figure this out,
Hmm.
that you would see them rally around that idea. And I think that that's kind of the nugget of of what we're trying to create here, and then hopefully spread, because it makes those people happier. And when they solve something, that's impact that can be shared with other people. And I think that you see in companies that really have been successfully innovative are those that actually have inspired that, and to the point that the core business is then, want some of that energy. Like, we want that here because we know that we have to be faster and move quicker and adapt and all of those type of things. We know we have to be truly customer centric and not just, you know, sitting around a conference room table imagining we're the customer. So it's really kind of really more about finding that, and it also may vary, based upon company culture, even positive company cultures, and it's like, what is that little nugget that actually empowers people to, as a team, let's work together and figure something out.
Yeah, thanks for that. Very, very insightful response. And there's something you said about uncertainty. It's really about trying to make sense of the unknown. And this brings me to your book, your latest book, Disruption Proof. Full title, Disruption Proof: Empower People, Create Value, Drive Change. What led you to writing that book? And what is it all about?
Yeah, so I think it's really all about what we've just been talking about the last few minutes, where it really is sort of looking at how the organization can structure people and work such that the natural output of it is more, it's actually, the way I put it, is more efficient execution based upon exploration work. And so how do you build that into the organization so that it doesn't feel like it's cannibalization, sort of the whole old school Clayton Christensen stuff. I know everybody's gonna like, what do you mean old school? But it's like, it's not about disrupting yourself. It's not about this other organization's gonna come in and disrupt you. It's not that you actually have to eat your own tail as a snake. It's about finding this emerging behavior that then will sort of flowers from within and takes over the organization, because that's what the circumstances require. And so I think that I don't know, I guess I think that the book was trying to show examples of businesses that have done that, either large scale or pockets within these organizations that have brought people together, cross-functional where necessary, interdisciplinary. Hey, this is a new opportunity. How do we actually engage the business units, as opposed to me, what that old school way of doing it is like, here's your little innovation, silo over here. You guys go figure out what's going to happen in 10 years. I think that's like largely failed. And I think that what we need to do is figure out how from the beginning, there's buy-in from these other parts of the organization. So that's really what the last book is about. Really, all of these things that we've been talking about.
And I believe it's available on Amazon and other major book sellers.
Anywhere anywhere you can buy a book.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I haven't read it yet, but I have made a note. It's on my reading list, definitely. I look forward to digging into it to learn a bit more about, the concepts you've just shared, and the insights, as well as the examples with organizations that might have failed or succeeded in some aspects of the concepts. So
yeah, well, that kind of describes everybody to a certain level, right? Yeah.
Do you have anyone you could share at this point? Maybe an example from your book. You don't have to name names. Is there anyone that comes to mind?
Well, I think in terms of, I guess, what I would call lean innovation transformation, I think ING is a really good example. The bank in Europe, they did a full-on agile transformation as well, like organizing the whole company based upon missions than functions. And I think that always has its challenges, but I think that in the end, they kind of brought these two different endeavors together, one being this agile transformation and this other being what we call lean innovation. And so they really started practicing the empathy and the exploration work and the experiments, and those things ended up sort of combining. And I think it's always interesting when you can theorize about this stuff, but when do you actually get to see the results? And so a lot of this, most of this work was all done pre-pandemic. And then some of the stories that came out of different pockets of the organization during the pandemic were really, really quite extraordinary in ways that they were able to adapt to, finding yourself suddenly in this world, that they could point back to these lean innovation practices being the impetus for being able to change like that. So I love those stories where you're actually able to see that, okay, we applied all of this. Here's like this major, environmental change brought on by the pandemic. How did the company respond? And so I wrote a couple of stories about that stuff in the book Disruption Proof. And so there's a couple of other examples in there, but that's the one that really comes to mind because they just committed to it at a larger level than I've seen other organizations do.
Sounds awesome. So in addition to your books, The Lean Entrepreneur, The Entrepreneur's Guide to Customer Development, Disruption Proof, what other books have you found yourself recommending to people who want to know more about, lean innovation, agile? It doesn't have to be on the subject of lean innovation or agile, but just generally because you felt they were impactful to your life. What other books have you recommended to people and why?
Yeah, so I think that, people have recognized change in the world quite a bit over the last, 10 years or so, or 5 or 6 years. Pandemic is maybe lose all track of time, but and so the ones that I keep coming back to are not specifically agile or lean innovation. And so I would say Brene Brown's Dare to Lead. And I think that this is just an example of what we mean by empathy. You don't really have to go hug your customers. You don't have to hug your employees. It's not, but it's understanding how you apply those principles in a business environment, and the ability, like I mentioned earlier, for leaders to demonstrate vulnerability by admitting when they don't know and when they're wrong, that this is really important in changing. The other thing I'll throw out there that I love that Brene Brown talks about is this idea of rumbling. Again, we're not talking about some, kind of kumbaya moment here. It's really around bringing evidence to the table and having forceful discussions about what is actually happening and what you need to do next, but it's based upon this evidence. And I kind of we call it respectful rumbling, because rather than like my startup example I gave in the beginning of just arguing, it's really around, as a team of leaders, even, it's great to respect each other, but we also have to be direct and honest and have real conversations and not just sort of let everything go hunky-dory and then go back to your office and whine about stuff. So I think that there's this, I don't know, I sort of enjoy this ability to sit around with people and, kind of debate ideas and really try to get to the crux of things. And I think that we need that. And Brene Brown writes about that in Dare to Lead. I think that the other one, General McChrystal, Team of Teams. And I think that, I'm not sure he ever realized it, but I think he was writing about Agile. But what he describes, of course, is the U.S. military in Iraq and the difference between facing a traditional force versus a, sort of this ad hoc networked, new modern military force in Al-Qaeda, and the changes that he then needed to do to the military to be able to respond to that. And I think that it's really quite extraordinary in the sense that, unfortunately, in my opinion, that the military is often the first thing organization to learn about all of these things happening in the world. But it is a result of the digital revolution that now what you have are this interconnectedness that never existed before, that allow little ad hoc network entities to pop up everywhere. And this is the same thing that's happening in business, and it's the same thing that happens in the market. And Agile actually is a response to that. And so then we have to go back to, how do we implement Agile so that that's actually part of the organization? It's this interconnectedness and this ad hoc nature of forming teams and missions to accomplish goals, whether they're long-term or short-term. And so it's really an interesting analogy to, I think, what business requires.
So you've mentioned 2 books, Dare to Lead by Brené Brown and Team of Teams by General McChrystal.
Correct.
Okay, well, thank you. And
they almost seem like polar opposites, but it's sort of interesting.
Well, they are interesting. I haven't read Brené Brown's Dare to Lead, but I have listened to the audio version of Team of Teams, and I do agree there are some interesting insights, which one can basically something that you said about principles again. That principles you can draw from General McChrystal's narration of their experience in Iraq and how they had to adapt and all that, which you can apply to the commercial world or so.
Yep.
I completely agree. It was a very interesting book for me. Can the audience engage with you, and if so, how?
Yeah, so I'm Brant Cooper on all social media, really, but maybe primarily LinkedIn, and I encourage people to reach out. I'm Brant at brantcooper.com is my email, and I respond to I'll respond to everybody. My company's website is movestheneedle.com, and we're launching some online courses that hopefully make learning some of these new behaviors a little bit more scalable. So I invite people to check that out. But yeah, happy to engage with any of your listeners.
Sounds great. Well, thank you for sharing those. And this would also be in the show notes. And would you have any final words for the audience? Any ask?
I don't really have, I don't think any ask. I think that, I don't know, I guess one other little story that summarizes part of my life was this idea that I forget every once in a while that change happens because you as an individual decides to make a change. And I think that, like, some people, I think that just comes naturally to it and they live their whole life that way. I'm not that way. I'll sit back for a while and kind of look around and go like, well, who's going to fix this? And then I realize, oh, well, you have to do it. And so I encourage other people to maybe actually, look at themselves in that way, and sort of that own self-awareness goes like, oh, well, I guess it's me. I think that it's easy to be scared of the risks, supposedly, but I also think that generally the risk is in doing nothing. And so you might as well go for it.
Yeah, go for it. Take risks. Thank you for those words.
Based upon evidence.
Okay. Go for it. Take evidence, evidence-based calculated risks. How does that sound?
Yeah.
kind of made it very clinical. I think I've rephrased it in a way that takes off the off. But thank you. Thank you so much, Brant. It's been a pleasure meeting you and recording this episode with you. So thank you again for your time.
Thanks for having me. Fun discussion. Thank you.
Completely agree.
That's all we have for now. Thanks for listening. If you like this show, do subscribe at www.agileinnovationleaders.com. That's agileinnovationleaders.com, or your favorite podcast provider. Also share with friends and do leave a review on iTunes. This would help others find this show. I'd also love to hear from you, so please drop me an email at ola@agileinnovationleaders.com. Take care and God bless.